Thank you so much. So to start off, I'd like to ask each of our panelists how you got interested in working in the area of Title IX and pregnancy protection. If we can start with Jessica.
Thanks. So my mom was a pregnant student. All of my earliest memories are on campus. I was one of those fortunate student parents, children who was able to make it into campus childcare. And I wouldn't be the person I am today if I hadn't had those experiences and that support from my mom's institution. So I take this very personally because I see a lot of the supports that she had just aren't available for other student parents. And really that needs to change. So I started this work because of her, and I stay in it because it's so amazing to be able to work with so many pregnant and parenting students who are frankly on the verge of getting pushed out of their education.
Yeah, I love hearing that story and that perspective of a child, of a student parent. I came into this work because I was a student parent myself. I was a teen mother. I got pregnant my senior year of high school, and I started college with a nearly 3-month-old baby. So I was a new mom. I was a new college student, kind of all of those things happening at one time. It was extremely intimidating. I was not at an institution that had any sort of supports for pregnant or parenting students, and also was at a predominantly white institution where I was one of very few Black students on campus as well. And so my college journey was extremely difficult. I had periods of homelessness. I had times where, you have to pick between a diaper and baby wipes and a textbook for class. And it was extremely isolating. And I certainly had experiences where I ran into professors or different people at the institution who were not supportive of me being a mom and didn't understand my experiences and weren't accommodating when I had a challenge that came up. And so took all of that, and now I'm an advocate for parenting college students through my organization, Generation Hope. And it's just the most rewarding work, and I'm so thankful to be a part of it.
Hi, so piggybacking on both of what you've said, I come to this work because of my parents. My parents were pushed out of school in the early 1970s, and then just a deep desire to support teen parents to pretty much avoid child welfare intervention. And then I happened upon their school environment, and that struck me as had a causal connection between lifelong involvement with systems that, first of all, diminish you sometimes as your humanity, but also leave you yearning for more and living in poverty. So those were the things that motivated me to get more deeply connected to Title IX legislation and work.
So both college students and high school students are impacted by Title IX. I think I'm going to start off with college students. I think most people think about college students as being sort of young, recent high school grads who are pretty far from the responsibilities of parenting. But it's actually a significant number of university students have children or are pregnant. So I was wondering if you could speak to how many university students are pregnant, how many are raising children, what do their lives look like?
So it's funny when I go and talk to people who are working in higher ed every day about the number of parenting college students out there, their jaws drop on the floor. And these are, college administrators, they're faculty and staff, professors. And it's nearly 5 million students across the country who are parenting and juggling, going to school and working, and all of the responsibilities that come with that. And when I say that number, I also think about the millions of other students, other parents who would enroll in college or who enrolled in college at some point, but had to stop out because the system is not set up for them to succeed. There aren't accommodations, there aren't supports, and these are really environments that don't value and validate parenting. And so it's a huge population, both those who are enrolled and those who would be enrolled if we could really transform higher ed to be more supportive of student parents. when we look at the population, we know that that population, they're more likely to be students of color. They're more likely to be students with low income. They're more likely to be students who are first generation college students. When we're looking at, race specifically, it's almost half of all Black female undergraduate students across the country who are parenting and going to school. So again, significant population, and they're really at the intersection of all of these different groups that we often talk about in silos. Again, first generation college students or students with low income, and parenting college students are really at the center of so many of those intersections, right? And so it's really important, as we're talking about equity in education and in higher ed, that we are talking about parenting college students. And unfortunately, that's not happening enough across the country.
And to answer your question about the pregnant college students, frankly, we don't know. Nobody has solid numbers on the number of students who are having children in higher ed. So we can track them at individual points in time, and we see they put it on their financial aid application, for example. Something's changed in their family, but we don't know how many pregnant students were there. And of course, we also, on many campuses, just don't have good data on how many student parents are on that particular campus. And so if you don't know how many there are, you don't know who they are, how are these campuses supporting them? And it's, I think, really important thinking about a lot of these pregnant students. They need often accommodations. They need to protect their health on campus. They, just like anyone else, need that campus housing. And we're seeing again and again that they are denied those basic accommodations. All too often, they're not able to take off any time when they do give birth. It's very challenging for a lot of these students to come back. And so we know the deck is stacked against student parents in terms of housing, food security, all of the basic needs challenges that a lot of these families are facing. But we're seeing, even before the child is born, these tremendous barriers to pregnant students continuing in their education.
So Title IX also protects pregnant high school students.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the demographics of these students, Benita?
I mean, the demographics speak, it mirrors what you see at the post-secondary level, in that well, depending on where you are situated in the country, there are largely more lower income young women or young people who become pregnant and parenting. I think what's interesting, that the comments about we don't know about what's happening on the college campuses, we know even less about what's happening at the high school level, because oftentimes those are the young people or the young women that you see pushed out of school systems or disappear from school systems on their own because of the stigma attached to being a young parent. So, while the numbers are coming down in terms of pregnancy rates among younger women, there still seems to be a lack of visibility and supports for them available at the high school level. And there is no real research happening to talk about what are the best practices and models out there to help support pregnant and parenting students, whether they are in, if you will, segregated settings where specialized programs, or mainstreamed with their other peers.
When you say segregated settings, do you mean programs that are specifically for pregnant people?
Yes, because I think that the reason why I call them segregated settings is because school districts largely and heavily rely on them when they want to push out young people, young women. I should say young people necessarily, but young women, and they encourage them to go to those settings. And sometimes those settings don't offer enough of the curriculum to help them matriculate toward graduation or even stay on the same pace as their peers in the school setting that they left. And they don't always have childcare available to them postpartum.
And they don't always have a choice going into that program. Sometimes it's presented as a choice, but in reality, we know they are being pushed out of the regular classroom and into a setting that's not meeting their needs.
Right, absolutely. And the difficulty is because there are very few scholars or advocates who look at the secondary level. It's very hard to kind of get a clear picture on it. what happened in New York City was very specific in that we had enough information anecdotally from young women as well as school administrators around. We had 4 programs for pregnant students, and they were strongly encouraged to go there. We also had at the time, a maternity rule that was embedded in the chancellor's regulations that encouraged young women to take maternity leave without real supports around it. So what was intended to be a good thing actually created another avenue or mechanism to facilitate young women leaving their educational settings.
So what are some of the protections that are available to pregnant high school students?
It varies. That's what it's not standardized across systems because it really depends. Like I'm in New Jersey, and New Jersey has regional schools. So local school districts can strongly encourage young women to go to a regional school, or young parents. It's interesting because it rings out as this very neutral language about it being for young parents, these settings. But we know that pregnancy is not largely visible, but is visible with young women. So they are the ones that they're more burdened around identifying childcare, making sure they keep up with their education. And what also puts them at greater risk is the possibility that they might interact with child welfare officials, and that something about their own perceived, if they're missing school, what might be considered ed neglect, and would subject their parents and then them to a child welfare investigation, or how they are managing that early parenting, which we know is a stressful time under the best circumstances, but that also puts a spotlight on them, which also influences whether they disappear from systems.
So it seems like there's a little bit more available to pregnant college students. What is available to? Oh,
Arguably, yes.
Nicole is.
I mean, when you're a minor, you're subject to a lot of different, whether it's parental rules or school rules or societal perceptions of how you should be behaving as a young woman.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to I think it's fair to say that there is a ton of work to do at the K through 12 level and the post-secondary level. There are different challenges in college, and it's interesting because Generation Hope, we support young parents who are working on their college degree. So we are often at that transition point between high school to college. We have worked with students who are, leaving their senior year of high school. They are, going to a school that requires uniforms, for example, and they get to a point in their pregnancy where they can't fit their uniform. We've had students who have been told, well, the policy is if you don't wear a uniform, you can't come to school. And so they're being forced to stay home from school. We've had to have conversations around Title IX protections, with those schools about what is allowable and what's not allowable, what is okay and what's not okay. And then what are the real ramifications in the life of that student? And I think Benita, talked about that. Disappearing from the school system has huge long-term impacts, not only on that student, but on their child, right? And then at the post-secondary level, we've had to help our students advocate with professors who they're being unbending with attendance policies for their class. When we have Generation Hope scholars, so we call them scholars. When one of our scholars is about to give birth, or is coming up against a parenting issue or challenge, has a sickness, something like that with their little one. So there's a ton of work, and I think what is interesting about higher ed is, this system, the higher ed system, is a very elitist system. There is a notion about who deserves to be sitting in a college classroom and who doesn't, and who is supposed to go to college and who is not supposed to go to college. And I think that there are some different perceptions and things that happen at the K through 12 level, but that is a real issue at the post-secondary level. And parenting students do not belong in a college classroom in terms of the way that higher ed currently functions. So it is extremely difficult to say, hey, this is a right that this student has, when the perception at a university or even at two-year colleges, sometimes we run up against this, that these students don't belong here, they should have made different life choices, and college isn't for them. So I think we have a lot of work to do at the post-secondary level as well.
A lot to say here. I was going to say thank you for surfacing that. This is a huge equity issue. It's a gender equity issue. It's a racial equity issue. And not just because women of color are more likely to be student moms, but also because of just the intersection of that bias. We are already told we don't belong in higher ed. And then when you find out you're a mom on top of it, or an active parent on top of it, it's just layer upon layer of bias and exclusion. But I do want to point out that most of what y'all have surfaced has been illegal for 50 years. Title IX, it requires pregnancy accommodations, so they should make that uniform change. It requires leave for medically necessary absences. So those students should be able to take the time that they need and come back. They should have lactation accommodations when they return, and non-discrimination. So all of these statements saying you don't belong here, I see those as Title IX huge red flags. But unfortunately, too many folks don't know about their rights, and too many administrators at the K-12 and college level are just now getting up to speed with these requirements that have been on the books for decades.
No, I agree. I think that people, was speaking to some friends, and they think about Title IX as it relates to access to sports. But I think about Title IX, obviously in the education context. But I think that what compounds the inability of people to assert, or young women, particularly poor young women, Black and brown poor young women, to assert their rights to education, is all of the other things, the interactions that they experience with systems, whether it is, I think about TANF. The TANF benefits does not support a pregnant and parenting student at the secondary or the post-secondary level. In fact, it's more punitive, it seems, at the post-secondary level. So it's just like, when you start to look at what's swirling around them, I feel like our role as advocates or as legal scholars is to make sure that we are pushing and, breaking through the noise on their behalf, because most times they're just trying to navigate what is already a Herculean task of accessing education, accessing their child care that is not necessarily attached to a university, but is community-based. So there's limited access to seats or eligibility requirements that they may not meet. So I think that one of the things that in this new, as we look at this 50-year-old law, 50-year-old law, what are the things that we also need to think about braiding our advocacy to support? Like TANF benefits are a huge issue for your ability to access and sustain your engagement in education or childcare. Those are two huge areas of concern.
Just so you said that it's 50 years of Title IX. And as all of you have noted, students are still facing a variety of challenges. What was life like for students before Title IX? Like, what's different now?
Well, okay.
Wow.
I am 51, and I'm telling you, my parents, both of my parents, so it's interesting because that's when I happened upon that first case and really sat down with New York City. I was like, y'all know about Title IX, and this is not cool. And they were like, oh my gosh, let's figure it out together. And they did. So that was the commitment that we had under that chancellor's leadership back when we made transformation. But I will say that I always think of myself as one of the Title IX babies, my brother and myself, because I was born in 1970. My parents were actively pushed out of school. But I also think that as a result of my mother being pregnant, but also as a result what was happening around education and access for Black students in general around that time. Like I grew up in Michigan, they were in Michigan. There were a whole bunch of de facto segregation cases that were surfacing, and ways to, these are the Title IX, or the lack of awareness is also an opportunity to control who has access to education. And I think you said that earlier, Nicole, right? I think you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's highly connected to bias and discrimination and all of these issues kind of converging together all at once. So absolutely.
Before Title IX, these opportunities, I don't even think were on the menu for most women, most people who could become pregnant. And, you know, we've seen dramatic shifts. We now have more women PhDs graduating every year than men. We have gender parity, or reverse parity. Women who traditionally have been in the mothering roles are now well represented in education, but which women are having that chance? That's really the thing that we want to lift up, is the fact that while we have seen tremendous changes, it still hasn't reached all of us yet. And we need to make sure that all of us have an equal chance at an education, and also that we're okay afterwards. You know, you look at the student debt ratio for student parents, it is shocking. You know, it is still a life-changing investment, but the costs are far too high.
Mm-hmm. You know what I was thinking when you said that about what was it like before? And it just dawned on me, the Crittenden schools and the Crittenden homes. But again, who had access to those things? Like I always think of like Mad Men, that television show, like what was it like before? But there were homes for pregnant girls, or there were adoptions, opportunities to get facilitate adoptions. But then then you talk about the valuation of babies, and who deserves to go back to their lives or to pick up where they left off, where a majority of those public or philanthropically supported opportunities were not available to Black women or brown women. They literally had to leave school and figure it out. So those are some of the other issues that were that this was say is I think that is not Title IX is, the beginning, but like what shapes their lives is what really, we need to really think about that as we think about the next 50 years. Like what supports Title IX advocates should be talking about to braid together or blend together a shared agenda around change and access.
It actually keys into my next question, which is what is the future of Title IX pregnancy protections? What work still needs to be done? Nicole, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, it builds perfectly off of what we were just talking about. I mean, one thing that I think is really important to elevate is we released a study a couple of years ago where we were surveying student parents across the country and figuring out how they are experiencing higher education. One of the things we asked about was Title IX. It was really interesting that only about 40% of our students that we surveyed knew about Title IX and knew who they could talk to on their campus if there was a Title IX violation. So I think that's one big thing, is that so many students don't know their rights. They don't know about Title IX. They might connect it more to athletics and sports than they would to their own parenting situation. So I think we have a lot of work to do around educating folks, students, educating people working within our education institutions around what Title IX is, who it covers, who it supports, who it protects, and how do you do something about a violation, or maybe if you feel like your Title IX rights have been violated. So there's a lot of work to do there. I also think it's really important to think about the advances that Title IX has created for this population, but also to think about where things stand now with student parents. If you are a student parent, you're 10 times less likely to graduate than a non-parenting peer. You are, I think it's only about 8% of single mothers earn a degree within 6 years. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of building upon Title IX to make sure that there are protections in place, that people are aware of those protections, but also how do we transform our education spaces at the secondary level and at the post-secondary level to really embrace parenting. One of the things we've talked about today a lot is the challenges that parenting students are up against. But what we often leave out of the conversation are the assets that parenting students bring to any environment that they come into. I mean, these students are highly motivated. They are really driven. They are so resilient. They are excellent time managers. We know that student parents have 50% less time than their non-parenting peers to devote to their coursework. And yet they have higher GPAs on average than their non-parenting peers. So this is a population worth investing in. And it's not happening across our education systems. We have to do more to take the advances that have been made with Title IX, to build upon them, to bring in these other resources and supports like childcare, like TANF reform, all of those things, and just getting people to understand the connection between student parent work and DEI work, the extreme connection, the strong connection between making sure these students are successful and are thriving, and the race equity statements that so many institutions put out over the past 2 years with no action behind them. This is an opportunity to put real action behind those equity statements with a population that is here, that is ready, that is motivated, and that is deserving. And I think that to me is where we take the next 50 years.
What she said. Thank you. When we started the Pregnant Scholar back in, 2015, I present to Title IX coordinators and they would say, that sounds great. What law is that? We've come a really long way. People are on the whole trying to do right by these students, but you're absolutely right. There's so much more education to do. The Pregnant Scholars Helpline, we support people nationwide who are looking to implement policy changes or who need help navigating discrimination on their campus. And I can't tell you how many people say, like, where was this information when this crisis started? I wish I would have known sooner. So I hope everybody who's listening to this can help spread the word on that. To piggyback a bit off of what Nicole just said about what's next for Title IX, I'm really focused on what's happening after birth. Title IX regulations have those clear standards for accommodations, leave, and non-discrimination for the birthing parents. Afterwards, it's very light. We know that being a student parent, being a parent who's active, that's traditionally considered a feminized role, right? There's the motherhood bias and there's bias against men who are playing active parenting roles. There is a gender link. There is discrimination based on those old gender roles of what makes a good man, what makes a good woman, what makes a good parent or father, mother. But frankly, at the end of the day, that's really challenging to explain how policies which negatively impact student parents are also sex discrimination. That link has not been made by the Department of Education. That link's not been made on a lot of college campuses. And I think we really need to start talking about it. If we want gender justice, we need to support all family caregivers, and we need to actually acknowledge the ways that student parents' caregiving duties are actually an issue that could be covered under Title IX, and that institutions could be legally required to provide more support for their student parents as a part of pursuing gender equity in education. So that's where my head is. But I really have to say, I think it's all hands on deck for this population, especially with the pandemic. These are incredibly hard times for student parents, and we need a wider network of support to step up for them.
In terms of the future of Title IX, another question that I wanted to ask about it was that the Supreme Court seems poised to overturn Roe v. Wade, which is the landmark case establishing that people have a right to choose to have an abortion without significant government interference. Is there a way that might impact Title IX pregnancy protections for students?
I hope more folks step up to make sure that students who are forced to carry pregnancies are supported on the back end. Frankly, I'm sad we're even having this discussion. But I will, I'll say very clearly, if your choice is between, having an abortion, not continuing the pregnancy, or completely giving up on your educational goals, having no access to the career and economic opportunities you want, that's not a real choice either. We are doing this work in the name of gender equity, in the name of racial equity, and in the name of reproductive health justice. Because if that choice is completely limited, if we're not giving students the support they need to be healthy during their pregnancy and to actually continue on their education and support their families, that's not really a choice, frankly.
Yeah, I would just say, I think regardless of where people fall on this issue, there is something that no one can deny, which is there are not enough supports in place for young parents and for parenting college students to thrive. That is the fact. It is not something to debate. And so we have a lot of work to do if we want to see families thriving, all families thriving. This is where we have to put our energy and our investments. And at the end of the day, education is the best path to economic mobility for families. That's a, again, non-negotiable. It's a it is what it is. And so we have to put more investments in place to make sure that young people who do experience a pregnancy, who do become parents, as well as, college students who are parenting and are caregiving, that they have the resources that they need to get to that graduation stage. That's absolutely imperative. And something I just want to stress too, often I talk to folks about student parents, and this is a changing status. I could come into your university today and not be a parent. Tomorrow, I'm a parent, right? So this is an issue. This is not a small population that, is kind of separate and over here. This could be any college student at any time can become a parent. Same thing at the high school level. So we need to make sure that we have supports in place no matter, no matter what, so that all students can be successful. It's really important for people, I think, to make that connection and to not think of this group as this separate group, kind of away from these other students. Any student, I was an honor roll student. I was college bound. I had just been accepted into several different schools when I discovered my pregnancy. I was the last student that people would have thought would be a teen mom. And that's where I was. So I'm hoping that people also understand that this is important to invest in for all students and to have these supports in place.
I agree with you both. I do think when I think about Roe and what we're up against in the broader context and bringing it back to the reproductive justice discussion, like if people, if we're compelling people to have babies, or if they're choosing to have babies, no matter the path to parenthood, we need to make sure that there are supports not only in place in the academic settings, but what are the supports that need to be around to fortify your participation in the academic setting? Because I think, to your point earlier, you can enroll, but if you can't get through graduation, that's not going to put you on a path towards success, particularly for young people who are more economically vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. Transportation, childcare, TANF, all of those things are, huge in terms of making sure that these folks are successful.
Yeah. And I think that there's an opportunity to not only, as the education spreads among Title IX administrators about their obligations, also an opportunity to talk about coordinating a different understanding around policy as it pertains to those ancillary supports to keep young people in their education settings.
So I'm going to ask my last question. This is the same question I end all of my interviews on. Is there anything I didn't ask about that you think is really important for people to know?
Oh, wow. I think that is more like not what do you need to know, but what do you need to do? Like how do we activate you to make change in your community? How do we activate you to pay attention to this particular issue? and if you are part of the conversations related to sports, how do you start to talk about the other pieces of Title IX? How do we activate you to be an activist around the issues embedded in Title IX that you may not be familiar with?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think all of this can be really overwhelming. We're talking about our entire economic system here and wrapped up in our education system and equity. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. There's a lot that individual campuses and communities can be doing to better support pregnant and parenting students. One small example, I have students contact me all the time who have to drop out of their STEM classes because they can't avoid toxic exposure. I had a student just tell me that her professor refused to tell her what chemicals she'd be exposed to in the lab, and is very worried about birth defects, right? So these are not, they don't have to always be massive investments. They don't have to always be nationwide programs. Just give us a shot at belonging at your institution, right? Focus on attacking as many of these angles as you can. And it's amazing what individual institutions have been able to accomplish with formal supportive policies for pregnant students and for parenting students.
Yeah, I think totally echo all of that. I think I would add, I had a conversation around Title IX a couple of years ago with some folks working in higher ed. And one of the things that was like a common theme was institutions feeling like they didn't have the resources to fully implement and educate folks within the institution around Title IX. And I also think about the fact that the largest share of student parents are at community colleges. So we're talking about historically underfunded institutions. I think there's an opportunity here to also talk about what do institutions need in terms of resources and supports to be able to really implement these changes, to be able to enforce policies, create policies, to educate their workforce around Title IX rights, to make sure they're educating students and informing students, whether it's sending a text over a mass text system and saying, hey, do you know you have Title IX rights? It's interesting because there's tension between these students, are most likely to be at historically underfunded institutions that are going to be cash strapped when it comes to having the resources to actually put a lot of these things in place and in motion. So I think there's also a conversation around how do we provide the resources for these institutions to provide the support to their students and to their community.
And the Department of Education is about to put out new Title IX regulations. A lot of folks are going to be focused on Title IX and what we need to do to make the dream a reality. So this is the moment. This is the time. If you're feeling motivated, please join us.
Thank you so much. This was a fabulous conversation. I'm so honored to experience so much of your expertise. And I hope that our audience found it equally edifying. So thank you so much.